Catherine, for organizing. Oh, yeah, that's definitely not me. Thank you, Catherine, for organizing us and making this happen. And Andrea and John, thank you for making the time to come and talk to our students. And I think some of you may have met already, but not everybody. And I think if that's okay with everybody, we'll go directly to the main meat of the presentation, and we can have another meeting where we do more interactions between you guys. But I think it would be great to take the opportunity to listen to John and Andrea, what they can bring to us, and for you to think ahead and also have a chance to questions, because otherwise we'll be very squeezed. So apologies, no introductions, but I'm sure you soon meet each other. So over to John and Andrea, our implementation co-leads at the ARC, and hopefully you can tell what your job is and take everybody from there.
We will. We'll need to be able to share the screen, so you'll have to make us co-host if you wouldn't mind.
Let me work. You should be able to do it anyway.
Okay, that's great.
Can you see a blank screen now?
Yep.
Not quite sure why it's blank, so let's just sort that one out.
And while we're sorting out all these technological things, I'll have a little chat. So my name's Andrea LeMay, and this is John Gabay, and we're married, which is why we're sitting here at the same screen, and I'm not downstairs, which is usually where I am. So what we were going to do today is just to talk to you about implementation. We've called our talk Tales of Research, Art and Craft, because we're going to draw on some of the research that we've done in our lives and talk about then how we've applied some of those research principles to implementation. We're the joint implementation leads at the ARC at the moment, and our background is, for me, as a nurse, I started doing implementation research and the job of implementing research in the 1980s, and I've been doing it ever since. And can you just see that, by the way? Can you see the first slide? Anybody?
Are you seeing the slides or not?
No. So
okay, that's good.
I'll continue to talk.
Okay.
And John has a background in public health. We're both emeritus professors from the University of Southampton. And John
is rubbish at getting his Zoom to work at the moment.
Rubbish at getting his Zoom to work.
I'll sort it out. Don't worry. Here we are. Share screen. There we go.
Has most of his research life been trying to look at how research gets into practice, and what are the things that help that to happen, and what are the things that actually stop it from happening. So here we are. I think you've got, yes, there you go.
You've got a screen that says who we are and why?
So that was good.
Excellent.
I get the busking today, so I've busked us through to the first slide.
That's good.
Phew. So you know who we are. You know a little bit about our backgrounds.
What you probably don't know is that we started working together about 20 years ago when we were we discovered that we had a common interest in what actually happens when people use research in practice, and we started to do research in that. So we'll be talking today about that, really. The work that we've been doing together over the past 20 odd years has been informed by a very wide range of, one might say, eclectic range of theoretical frameworks. Here are some of them. Some of you who are more social science oriented will recognise some. We've had to draw on all of these things to be able to put together the sort of story we're going to tell you, and we are telling you a story about how we feel we've understood a little bit more about how people use research in practice, and then how we've used that in our current job. So the methods that we've used in our research have been, what we'll be talking about mainly today is ethnographic, but we've also used case studies, we've used action research. We're almost always doing iterative and participative research, which is developmental rather than summative. In other words, we often assess the findings as we're going along and tailor the continuing research to suit the circumstances we're in, which is all part of our way of thinking. And a lot of our research, as you'll see, and a lot of our work now focuses on how people actually interact on the relational side of things. Now, having been in this, as Andre said, she's been in it since the mid-1980s, and indeed so have I. And in fact, you could say when I was a house doctor working in hospital, I tried to introduce different ways of doing things, which were research-based, about different ways of notes and so on, with patchy success. Over those decades, there have been many different ways of trying to. I'm the host, and Nicole Dartington has just said she's coming, so I've missed her. So yeah, there's been a plethora of approaches to implementing research, which does include things like education and audit, and what was used to be called evidence-based practice, or at one point it was called had another name before that. We've used QI techniques, people have, to try to introduce research into practice, risk management techniques, and lots of models and frameworks like the Paris framework, which, by the way, there's a lecture on next week by one of the originators of that. In fact, this Thursday. And if you can't make it, all these are up online anyway. Something called knowledge to action, and so on. There are many different approaches. And of course there's the straightforward do it that sometimes comes from someone like NICE, which makes it almost an imperative to put a particular piece of research into practice. But despite all these different approaches, it's been very patchy in the degree to which it's been successful. So why is that? Well, many naive researchers and others, policymakers, have long held this traditional, what's called the rational linear model of research, that you create the research, you validate it through some clever scientific technology, scientific method, and then you transfer that somehow across this knowledge to action gap, some people call it, by disseminating it, and then people pick it up. And then they realize that there are still some problems, so they feed that back and you do more research and so on. Nice, simple, linear, rational model. The only problem with it is that it's too simple, it's too rational, it's too linear, it's too unidirectional and individualized. It unproblematizes so many things that need problematizing. It's asocial, it's acontextual. It just basically doesn't work. Otherwise, it's fine.
So we've, over the years, tried to work out what are the important features of implementation, and this is through a lot of reading, a lot of discussion, a lot of research. The things that we've thought are crucial are the first of all the context into which the research is being implemented, then the sort of evidence, its relevance, whether or not that research is really relevant to the context, and then the practitioners that are involved in doing that, the target audience and the other people, for instance, clients, patients, their relatives, who are going to be impacted by the implementation of this research. And then lastly, the ways that you would make a change to practice, the change methods, and management of that, and the facilitation of that. Because remember, we've said to you before that we're really interested in relationships, in interactions with people. If you can look at all of those things and you can make a successful plan out of that, then you're likely to have successful implementation. Now, some of you will be doing much more participative research at the moment, more co-production of research, and that will bring all of these things together. And so naturally implementation is something you're thinking about. Others of you won't have thought about implementation at all, and you will be thinking more about a research question and solving that. If you were to come into putting that into practice, then you, likely in partnership with somebody else, would have to think about these four things: the context, the evidence, the target practitioners, and the change method.
So we're going to have two main themes today. One is largely based on our own research over the past couple of decades, understanding how implementation can transform knowledge into the knowledge that's actually used in practice, because it's not the same as the research results usually. It's always adapted and changed, and we'll talk a lot about that. And then towards the end, we're also going to talk about some research we've been doing about the skills that people use particularly in quality improvement, but it also applies to the kind of work that people do to get research in practice, because that usually is a way of trying to improve quality, isn't it? So let's look at the first theme, understanding how implementation transforms knowledge, what actually happens to the nature of knowledge. The stories we're going to tell are actually based on 8 research projects we've been doing, as you can see, since 2000. We're not going to go into great detail about them, but just so that you're aware of the kinds of funding sources that we had and the kind of projects and when they happened. The latest one, in fact, the paper only came out last week in BMJ Quality and Safety. We'll give you all the references at the end. Before we start, it's always nice to say thank you to our funders, and we'll say thank you to our co-researchers at the end. So what are the principles that have come out of those 8 studies, sort of all pulled together into some kind of synthesis? Well, the first, as I've already hinted, is that we have confirmed what so many people are now saying, that research uptake is not a linear, rational process. It is far more complex than that. We discovered that when we were asked by the Department of Health to do a piece of work where we were helping policy-making groups for the care of the elderly to use research in the care packages that they were putting together. And that was the first project we did together. And the idea in those days of something that was, at the beginnings of evidence-based medicine, evidence-based nursing, was that you had this very nice process where you identify a problem, you frame a proper question, you search for the evidence, you appraise it, you seek and incorporate the user's views, which a lot of people later forgot, but that was part of the original evidence-based medicine model. You use the evidence to help solve the problem, and then you evaluate. All nice and clean. So the idea was, these people are wanting to put services together for the elderly. Let's identify what the problem is. For example, how do we keep the records so that all the different professionals can access them easily? Let's have patient-held records. That's a piece of research that showed it was more effective. And we gave them the research results, and we facilitated their discussion. And what did they do with the research they were given? Well, not that linear thing at all. They were doing all sorts of things with the bits of information they were being given. They were transforming them, they were misinterpreting them, they were blocking them, they were overestimating some of them, they were clarifying, rejecting, losing them, forgetting them. That's what goes on when a group tries to talk about something. And not only do people do these things to the research-based knowledge, but they don't just use the research. They use other things. They use what they know about the protocols and guidelines. They use their theoretical knowledge. They use experiential knowledge, in other words, their experience of what's happened in the past, and their local custom of practice, and their trial and error. There are many different kinds of evidence, many different kinds of knowledge that come into how people decide to practice. Andre's signaling to me she wants to say something.
And that's really important for you. All of you here, apart from a couple of you, are PhD students, aren't you? And at the moment, the thing that's most important to you is research evidence. It's evidence that you are developing to answer a research question or illuminate a research problem. Now, we think then, as researchers, that research is the most important thing. But actually, it's just one. And that's what we're trying to tell you here. Your research is the most important thing to you, but it's only one of the things that's important to the audience that are going to be implementing it. And if you remember nothing else from this talk, please remember that.
What we have found is that people use, and what lots of people have now found, many sources of evidence which include their own experience, the experience of their patients and the patients' carers. They use national policy, they use audit, they use professional meetings where they've heard about things from other people, they use websites, they use systematic reviews as they're supposed to do, but that's about the closest this list gets to research. So that is one of the reasons why the uptake of research is not a linear rational process, and why research findings are always melded with many other sources of evidence as they are put into practice. Another piece of work that we were involved in was commissioning groups. They were actually called primary care teams, I think, in those days. I can't remember. No, primary care groups. And they were doing basically the work of what CCG's, clinical commissioning groups, do now. And we were looking at how these clinical commissioning groups were putting evidence into practice in their policies, in the contracts that they were drawing up with, say, the local hospital or community services. And there might be some evidence-based innovation that's suggested, and the idea was that they would simply put that through their system, and the evidence-based innovation would end up being used by the local hospital or cardiac services or whatever. But in fact, what we observed and what we learned from these case studies was that the evidence gets bounced around in all sorts of different ways by people, and what comes out is a different shape. It's a different kind of thing from the innovation that came out of the research, the kind of research that you guys are doing. It won't look like that by the time it's put into practice in a trust, having been contracted, even if people have recognized it. And we call this the implementation game. It's a bit like one of these pinball machines where you put the ball in and it bounces around, but you don't just put a ball in. What you put in is a piece of potty putty, and if we were doing this live with you, we would hand you now a piece of potty putty and ask one of you to make a shape out of it. And then, oh, Andre's going to do it. We've got some on the desk. And you would make a shape of it, and you'd pass it along a line of 6 people. And surprise, surprise, by the time you get... She can't open it. By the time you get to the end...
Can't understand the research results.
Yeah. She's having trouble reading the research here. It needs strong intellect to do this. So you pass this along, and it changes. It becomes something different at each time that it hits something. I'm going to open this damn thing. It kills me. Why did you do this? No.
And whilst John's struggling with the tin, it does make a nice metaphor, doesn't it? Often the tin can't be opened. The research paper is so dense and unreadable that you can't actually get to the knowledge that you need to get to. I'm just going to go and slip over to get the digested version while John continues.
No, I'm going to get my trusty penknife out and I'm going to open this damn thing. So, this is where I stab myself and the ambulance comes. Right, there you are. You can do that. So
we see
what happens inside the machine is that the evidence bounces around all the different components of the machine. And this, we used an example in our book on all this stuff. We used the example of a piece of work that I'd done many years ago, where we were trying to get a local health authority, as they were called in those days, to use the evidence-based management of heart failure. And you'd think that you've got the researchers who come up with the best way of treating heart failure, and you've got the cardiologists who do it. So why weren't they doing it? So when you start to look at what's going on, you see there's an awful lot of different actors. This is based on something called actor network theory for those sociologists among you. All these different organizations, things like hearts, diuretics, the process of clinical audit, the manufacturers who are involved, the guidelines, the exhortations from people, the cardiologists, the other cardiologists who disagree, and every one of these people, as they interact with heart failure, see it in a different way. Heart failure is a very different thing for a patient who's feeling desperate and breathless from the local finance officer who's trying to work out how on earth they're going to pay for these new echocardiograms that they're being asked to use. It means something different to each person. It gets transformed, literally. So the other lesson we want to bring to your attention at this point is that each actor transforms research-based knowledge when they use it. Have you managed to open that tin yet? No, hopeless. Well, we'll give up on that. Finally, before I think I'm going to hand on to Andre, another piece of work we did was a national program to introduce what are now called treatment centres. And they're very common now, there are lots of them around, but that was a new idea at the time, that you should go for elective surgery to a different hospital from the one that does the accident and emergency and the other stuff. And there was a blueprint, more or less based on evidence, centrally driven by the Department of Health, who funded it, and 16 different centres chose to be among the pilots. They were self-selected, and we watched 8 of them as they were trying to put this into practice and build their treatment centres. And the whole story is really in the one picture on the cover of the book. Each one looked totally different, depending on the locum circumstances, the local concerns, the uncertainty and the change that was going on, and enormous difference from basically putting a new label on an old ward to building a spanking new building to all sorts of different things. Same research, same government policy, same funding, different outcome.
So here's a potty putty I managed to get into the tin. You see, it starts off like that. If we were to pass it round the room to you, if we were to meet you for real, you'd all change it a little bit.
So
and
what we
you'd
do
make
is
something
make a
different.
little person, and by the time that person has been moved around, they become a different shape. They start to droop, they start to change, and so on.
So the important thing here that you've heard from those studies is that knowledge actually changes as it gets moved around people, around all of these actors that John was talking about. Even when you've got something as firm as a blueprint, it gets contextualized. So the research that you're doing at the moment will change. It will have to change when you've got those findings out there, so that it's contextualized and useful to practitioners, to patients, to clients. A lot of researchers are very precious about their research, but we can't afford to be. We have to acknowledge that if it's going to be of use, it will get changed. And so it might also be then hard to find that research. So the next thing that we did after all of this was to try to understand what people really did in practice. And this is a study that John will talk about again.
Okay, so this followed on from the study I told you about right at the beginning, which was where people were whizzing their knowledge around in all different, we call it the whizzy diagram of the arrows rather than the nice rational linear one. And we wanted to know if that happened in clinical practice, because that was a multi-sectoral organisation that we were working with, or a multi-sectoral group. So Andre sat on a plane with the research funder, which is always a useful thing, on the way back from the conference, and we got a little bit of funding to do an ethnography of a primary care practice. And see how they were putting research into practice. And we came up with this idea that some of you may have heard of called mind lines, which are a kind of internalized, collectively reinforced guideline in the head that we all tend to use when we're in practice. We don't use the actual guideline as printed usually, but we build that into something that we know works better in our circumstances as a result of our experience. It's our embodiment of what we like to call knowledge and practice in context, all one word, which is very different from the research knowledge that you guys will come up with in your research, as we've suggested. And a mind line is something that you use very quickly. It's a bit like those of you who know System 1 and System 2 thinking, you know, the rapid thinking and the more logical linear thinking that we do. This is a way of thinking rapidly, flexibly, malleably, within the context, and coming to a quick decision even in a very complex situation, as many clinical problems are. Those of you who know anything about how doctors and nurses learn will know that we often learn to recognize patterns and using what they call heuristics or illness scripts or rules of thumb. Different researchers have called them different things. It's more than that. It's taking into account not just the disease and the patient, but all the context that you're working in. All sorts of things go into a mind line. Those heuristics and illness scripts and so on that I talked about, the embedded science that you learnt when you were in university, the guidelines that you've read, the peer values, the institutional culture, the role models' behaviour, the local norms and routines, what do we do around here, how do we treat heart failure around here, what your teachers and trainers told you, and the tacit experiential knowledge that we all build up over a lifetime, and the practical skills and the soft skills as well as the technical skills, and we'll come back to that. So in this, where is the research evidence? It's not very clear, and when we asked the practitioners as we were watching them doing what they were doing and formulating their policies, they found it very difficult to point to specific research. Unfortunately, when we published this in the BMJ back in 2004, we had the title Guidelines or Mind Lines, and a lot of people now think that doctors don't use guidelines because they use mind lines, but guidelines are really an important part of a mind line. They are built into the way we all understand how we should practice, but they get the guidelines, like the other things that were going on in that implementation pinball machine, they get changed, they get modulated and modified to suit the local circumstance. And mind lines do involve a lot of tacit experiential knowledge, but they're not just tacit. Some people think mind lines are tacit and they're opposed to guidelines. That is not the case. That's not what we found. The sources of evidence, well, we've already indicated in an earlier slide how many different sources of things go into this jumble of mind lines in one's head that one can draw on instantaneously when making a clinical decision. And again, the researchers are not very prominent in that. We liken this to a compost heap. You put all these different things into the compost, and somehow, by some magic, all these different contents of your compost heap, all these different forms of knowledge and experience and evidence, sources of the best way of doing things, they get transformed into this fabulous stuff that you don't quite understand, but that makes all the difference to the garden, and in this case, in the real world, that is, in our world, not to the garden, but to the way that clinicians, good clinicians, practice. And I forgot to say at the beginning, by the way, of this little bit of this talk, that the doctors we were working with and the nurses we were working with were uniformly regarded as the best practice in the area. They were really top-notch, but they did not just read research and read guidelines. They understood them and they worked with them together to change them into something that they could work with together.
So we found that when they were doing this kind of melding of their mind lines, they often got together in communities of practice where they shared their mind lines. So we began to formulate an idea that there were collective mind lines, which were mind lines that were driving teams forward, or practices, or wards, or whatever it was, but they were collective and very important. So at the end of this little section, what we know is that there are individual and collective mind lines, and that they embody the processes that are going on in practice. So when we set out to study these ways knowledge transfers around places, we were particularly looking at something called communities of practice. And communities of practice are instances where you can get people together to try to share knowledge and to help them learn from each other in a more social kind of way than sitting in a classroom. It's often people who don't know each other who get together, so they're really helpful in developing best practice, implementing, reshaping knowledge, promoting learning, and developing and sharing these collective mind lines. They're really good problem-solving mechanisms, and they'll allegedly allow knowledge to pass very quickly between people and innovation to move into practice, and alongside that allow people to own the changes that are being made. But I want you just to remember that they can be very unhelpful too, because if you can imagine a group of people getting together, always talking about the same sort of things, the same people, they can stop the spread of knowledge beyond the boundaries of the community, and they can actually perpetuate bad practice as well as good practice. So when we're talking about communities of practice, one of the really important things is to think through how you test and evaluate the stuff that's being talked about there. So we move on to the second theme today of the skills that you need to implement research. Now, these are a very broad skill set, and it's quite rare to find those in one single person. So often you're implementing alongside other people, aren't you? Alongside teams of people. So these are the sort of skills that we would like to have in a team of people who are embarking on the implementation of research. And as John alluded to, there's a really strong similarity between quality improvement and research implementation. Because if you think about it, the whole point of doing research is to answer questions, but also to improve the quality of a service of care, and so they're bound to be similarities. So this work we did mainly with improvement communities of practice to see what they did when they were working together. And we devised this amazing pyramid. And the logic behind this is that you've got a three-sided pyramid, and you need to take into account technical skills, soft skills, and learning skills when you're making improvements to practice. And it's no good focusing on just one side of these pyramids alone. They've got to all be built up to the peak, otherwise they'll just simply fall down. So when we're thinking about technical skills here, we've listed on this slide technical skills associated with improvement, but a lot of these are also important for implementation, and we use the one at the top of that slide, the PDSA, which looks at small tests of change. It's called Plan, Do, Study, Act, isn't it? Which sounds a bit weird. It's not the veterinary service for animals, okay, that you see advertised. But this is about taking a change, trying it out, evaluating it, maybe modifying it. So you're planning what you're doing, you're studying the impact of that, and then you're taking action to refine it and make it more successful. So those are the sorts of things that we're using particularly, but you might use any of those to think about how you would implement something into practice. And alongside those skills, there are lots and lots of models of knowledge, translation, transformation that we can use too. We talked about some of those, and John was saying we're going to have a seminar on Thursday about those sort of things too. So it's no good just being great at technical skills. You have to be able to build relationships with people. So you have to have a good grasp of the soft skills that you'd need as well. Team building skills, leadership, political skills, assertiveness, etc., etc. So you're building up that side of the pyramid as well. And also, because a lot of our work, everybody's work, is about learning, you also need to have learning skills there to help people learn, and for you to learn in either reflections on action or after action about what you've been doing, how it's gone, how has your implementation of your research worked in practice, how might you change things, might you use different technical skills, might you use different soft skills, and these things are usually iterative, this conversation, if you like, between the skills. So at the end of sort of thinking through the pyramid, you've built a team of people who are good technical skills, good soft skills, and good learning skills, and hopefully then you'll end up with some great implementation too. It looked as if it was pretty easy from that slide, didn't it? But this slide is meant to show you that it's not. It really isn't. It would be really easy to do this in a vacuum, but in the reality of practice, whether it's in social care, healthcare, occupational therapy, physiotherapy, in the community, in an intensive care unit, you've got all sorts of things going on that are either helping you or standing in your way. And obviously this is a bit of a joke cartoon drawn by a colleague of ours to show how policy, you see that guy at the top of the big desk, can really impact on the implementation. So can all of those people who are trying to take down or stand in the way of the things that you're doing, and misunderstandings and all sorts of things. So just remember that. And remember, we talked about that bit of potty putty in people's minds. That knowledge that you're putting in, that you're implementing, is swilling around all the time, and it's changing too. So implementation is quite a difficult and challenging thing to do, which is why we've spent the last 30 odd years trying to understand it.
The pyramid that we just showed you, the more realistic one, came from a subsequent study that we've just published as a paper. This is the reference to the report here, where we were looking at what skills are actually being used, and we came up with this idea of what we call socio-organisational, functional and facilitative tasks, or soft skills. See what we did there? And the idea is that in order for the groups that we were studying, to succeed, and some did and some didn't, in making improvements in the 3 different hospitals that we were studying. A very good hospital, one of the best in the country, one that was in special measures because it was basically, may I say the word, crap, and one that was somewhere in the middle. And each of them had groups of people that we were studying who were trying to make some kind of specific improvement. And the socio-organizational functional facilitative tasks, or the soft skills, include getting the right tone, the right ability for people to be able to speak together, to be able to understand each other's perspectives, to do that respectful critical dialogue that we talked about before, being able to manage the fact that they're being asked to do 7 different quality improvement studies or projects all at the same time, making sure that you really have understood what the problem is and you got the solution right, getting the message across properly to people, and so on and so on. These are not the sorts of things that you necessarily think of as a researcher when you're asking, how can I get somebody to use this fantastic new technique that I've just discovered works better than the old one. So implementing knowledge needs the right sort of skills. That's another principle from our research. And we're now going to move to the final study we're going to talk about, was one in Wales. And we usually say to people at this point, can anybody see a difference between those 2 pictures?
So shout out if you can.
Yeah.
Go on, Rosetta.
In one of the one to the left, the lady looks more comfortable with the guy.
The difference, can I say?
Yeah,
Yeah.
go on.
I see is that the left one, the lady obviously is in her room, so it's on her own. And the second is that she is participating and is part of a bigger group.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
great. And anybody else?
Looks like it's a colder day on the right-hand side.
Why is it a colder day?
She's got a scarf on, he's got a hat on and a coat.
Excellent.
Now, the reason he's got a hat on is not, your hypothesis was halfway right. The reason he's got a hat on is that here they are posing for a thing. Actually, they weren't comfortable with each other. It's interesting that you say that.
She was.
She was, he wasn't. He was feeling slightly awkward. By the time at the end of the project, she'd knitted him this hat. And they were close buddies. She treated him like a son almost. Now, he was the research officer for the organisation that ran the care homes. And we were doing work to try to get them away from the policy where, when this lady tried to pour a cup of tea when she first arrived in this care home, she got a shout from somebody saying, "Don't do that, that's dangerous. You'll have to let a member of staff pour tea." And she said, "Well, hang on, I've been pouring tea for 85 years. I don't need to be told how to pour a cup of tea." So how do we get to a situation where the staff were not allowed to interact normally with the clients, with the residents? They weren't allowed to discuss their own circumstances or have a normal chat or the normal banter that people expect, because that was considered unprofessional, where people living in basically what is their home weren't allowed to do things that they would normally do. How does that happen when all the research shows that it's much better to have a more conducive atmosphere, as one of you pointed out, more communal, more relaxed, less sparse and less professional? And that was achieved through working in the kind of way we've been talking about with all the different people, very ably facilitated by Nick Andrews, who ran that project.
So in the background to this, it's really important for you to know that what happened in this situation was that some rules, guidance from children's services have been taken forward to older people's services without a second thought. So this sort of distance and relationship safeguarding, if you like, have been taken forward inappropriately. And through this study, people began to question what was appropriate. And eventually, things changed. The policy in these organisations changed. And the policy across Wales changed. Because we brought these stories, and this is very important for all of you researchers, we brought the stories of the research to the policy makers with the people who were there. So these 2 people came and they talked about their experiences. So therefore, we could not only implement a change in research, but we can implement a change in policy, because the stories mattered. Okay, it's a really important way of implementing at a different sort of level.
Very quickly, we're going to now just spend a couple of minutes telling you how we're doing the the implementing of research in the East of England. This is the role that we've been involved in for the past couple of years. The first thing that we do is to try to pick topics like the sort of thing that you're doing research on that are suitable for implementation. Sometimes from the old Clark, for those of you who know that was a predecessor of the ARC, and sometimes outputs from the ARC itself, and your own work may well end up as one of these. We form a community of practice of health and social care staff and organisations of researchers, public and patients, and local organisations to discuss that, to work out the pros and cons of that research for their organisation and what they think may or may not work. We analyse what we call their claims and concerns, and we get them to agree an implementation plan by facilitating that community of practice, and we get them to start to implement that plan, doing the small tests of change. Remember the PDSA, the veterinary organisation that isn't, to use that and other methods of quality improvement or whatever, and to decide what they think success would look like and to evaluate it. And then if it works, we roll it out further and so on. So all of this being evaluated formatively as we go along as best as we can. And there is an evaluation of this on the website if you're interested, under the implementation bit of the ARC's website. We've used this now in 8 facilitated communities of practice that are either completed, underway. They're all associated with, I'm sure you're all familiar with the populations of focus in our ARC, and they range from work. They range from mental health services for young people and children to frailty services for end-of-life care and many other things in between. And just one of them, for example, as a result of 3 community of practice meetings, which took rather a long time to organise, but once they were there and got going, they moved fast. They've not only improved the service palpably and measurably for the clients, who are very difficult kids with challenging behaviours, but they're going to save, according to the health economics theme. Adam has helped us to do this, Adam Wagner. They're probably going to save £1.4 million per annum, as well as improving the service over the next 5 years in Peterborough. The lessons from this, Andre, do you want to talk about that quickly?
It looks easy, doesn't it? Said that before today. It looks easy. It's not necessarily. Requires a lot of preparatory work, a lot of relationship building, which is really important. There's been a great willingness to engage in this exercise, over 100 people so far, and it is about relationships, but it's also about enabling respectful, critical, and this is really important, dialogue. The critical is a bit that stops the community of practice from just going along with whatever it is that's being told to them. We want challenge, that's important, but in a respectful way. It works virtually and face-to-face, which is a good job, seeing as we've been working virtually for a long time now, and it is about the contextualisation of knowledge. And also it's very important, all of you are PhD students, your PhD supervisors will be saying this is just a small part on your research journey. It's the first step. And what I want to say here is that those first steps can actually have a big impact and make a big difference. Just like the PBS study John was just talking to, it was a Clark Fellows piece of work which mainly focused on an evidence synthesis. So we've already said that it's been evaluated, and that is a whole lot there. Principles for our intervention work are include all relevant parties, develop relationships, share perspectives, make sure about respectful critical conversations, maximise the skills that you need, analyse and deal collectively with the things that are causing problems, the barriers, work collectively with the things that are going to facilitate change, and try to get a consensus on how you can move forward. Once you've done all of those things, then you can move a bit faster using small tests of change and share the results of the change across all of those people too. So all the time we're trying to keep everybody involved. Everybody owns a bit of this, and all the bits together mean that they own the whole. So thanks very much.
We just want to thank our co-researchers. It's always a good idea to acknowledge the people who've helped you to do the work, And here are the references which will be up on the recording or up online if you want, for you to get to if you want to read any more about what we've been talking about. But we want to try and stop now in time for you to ask us a few questions.
So there you go. We're here for questions now, so fire away.
Thank you very much, both Andrea and John. Thank you for always inspiring us and making us aware, even though I feel a bit sometimes like, oh my gosh, am I doing enough to be ready for implementation? Does anybody have a burning question? Otherwise, I will start. Lydia, oh, sorry. I thought you had raised your hand. Oh, I think I'll ask then one to get started. What would be your best piece of advice for the students? Because we are training, PhD students to think and do things very systematically and be very rigid in a way, to an extent, because of methods. It needs to be very consistent. And then implementation throws us completely, because, as you said, it's about conversations, it's about adapting, and it's almost the opposite of what we are teaching, training. So what is the key piece of advice for the students to bear in mind in transitioning?
A couple of things, really. One is to try and talk to people as you go along. So even if you're not doing a piece of work that is co-productive, that you are co-producing ideas, if you like, as you go along, and keep a notebook of all of these ideas, because when you get to write that last chapter in your PhD, it's going to say, and what is the impact of all this stuff? What's the likely impact? What could we do to use this research? Then you can draw on those findings that you've had in your chats as you've gone along with people. It is a very difficult balance, isn't it? So you're going along with a very focused research protocol. Even if you've got a co-produced project, eventually you'll have a focused protocol, and you're going along to do that. That's got to be rigorous. The findings from that have got to be rigorously collected. Otherwise, we can't use it. It's only when you've got those findings that we can begin to see how they'll fit in the different contexts of care or services or whatever it is. So when you get right to the end of your thesis, please don't stop when you say, this is my contribution to knowledge, full stop, in the conclusions. That's not good enough. You have to think about how you might use that knowledge, how you might encourage other people to use it. And that's where you sneak in from the researcher to the implementer.
We're presuming that you all know what we mean by co-production, but just in case not, we're talking about involving people in the design and execution of the research right from the start. So clinicians, if it's a clinical subject, patients, members of the public, whoever it might be, as well as the research team.
How many of you doing projects like that? Okay, so a few of you, you're all very brave, because those are the most challenging of projects. But at the end, you will be able to say more convincingly, possibly, how you would implement them.
And that you're asking a relevant question and answering it in a way that people will find credible, because not everybody always does that.
So those of you who aren't using co-production from the start, towards the end of your PhD, you might gather together a group of people who could use your research findings and have a chat with them. Find out what they think about your research, how they might use them as well, and so you can play that into your closing remarks, if you like, and understandings of implementation.
Can I also just say, you're a group of, my maths is never very good, well, there's 16 people, 14 people on the screen now. You probably are, and if you're not, you ought to be, working as a community of practice, so that some of you have had experience of co-production and some haven't, and you can learn from each other, and you can help each other in that way if you give yourselves the space and time and allow yourselves to have genuine discussions about your work that are honest and robust. You could learn an awful lot from those who are involved in co-production, and maybe for those who aren't, you can show the ones who are doing co-production why they might be going adrift from sound methodology because they're in co-production. So there's a lot you can learn, and I do hope you are working or could work as a community of practice. Anyway, more questions?
Was that an offer, John?
Sorry?
Was that an offer too?
Well, you don't necessarily have to have an outside
You don't
facilitator.
need anybody
I'm
outside.
sure you could do it anyway, Anita. You've got the skills, but Yeah, I mean, most communities of practice are spontaneous and not facilitated. Ours are particularly directed, so we in a particular direction. I mean, not directed as in told what to do. So we do facilitate, but yeah,
Those are the sorts of things that actually I think, as a kind of very long in the tooth supervisor,
Andre has supervised
more people than
about
any of
50
you
PhDs,
had
by the way.
hot dinners. However, I think
Say again, how many? I didn't hear.
God, I don't know.
50 odd.
A lot. But probably not that
She
many.
had 20 on the books when she retired.
Anyway, that's neither here nor there. I actually think the informal is much more productive than the formalised with a sort of facilitator in these sort of things. You just need to get together and talk. That's all you have to do. It doesn't have to be a community practice, just get together and talk. The sort of stuff you do over a coffee. But the thing is with PhD students, especially in a far-flung geographical area, you don't have the opportunity to do it. So use a virtual space now to get together and chat.
Anyway, questions? Or challenges? Or disagreements, please. We love that.
Or you just all need to have a quick drink of something because that was so fast.
Sebastian.
I thank you very much for talking. It was excellent. I was wondering about about generalizability of findings where you have, I know it's a thing within co-production in general, but if you're really sort of diving into a specific team and understanding the dynamics between the individuals and the context, how you kind of retain that research, the core part of research, which is generalizability and being able to apply it across settings.
When you say, yeah, that's really tricky, isn't it? Because you're talking about taking the same findings and assuming that you can take them to another place and get the same results. Is that right?
I think that the question is better phrased as how can you, or what steps can you take when you're planning a piece of co-production research to try and maximize any generalizable findings?
Okay.
In the knowledge that you can't do it perfectly.
Yeah.
I think it very much depends on the sort of research that you're doing. What are you co-producing? You can co-produce a randomized control trial, can't you? You can co-produce anything you like, and it's in the nature of the co-production that's important. If you are co-producing a piece of research, let's say you're using action research, and therefore it was changing all the time, it'd be very important to note down how it changed and why it changed. And what happens in that sort of work, and a lot of qualitative work that comes from different research designs, is that you don't know if it's generalizable, and you just have to live with that. It is generalizable when somebody else says, yes, that makes sense. Yes, I'm going to use it. It's called goodness of fit. You see it and you know that that's going to work. It sounds really funny, doesn't it? I don't know what sort of work you're doing, but if you were looking at a randomized control trial, you'd be much more interested in reliability and validity and those sorts of things. But in a piece of work that's evolving to take account of context, what you're interested in is making a description of that work so rich that other people can understand it and they can say, yes, I can try that out.
I think I just want to add two things to what Andre said. One is that it depends who you're co-producing with. If you went to just one small team and worked with them, then I think your concerns are much more understandable than if you brought people from different areas, from different organizations with different backgrounds, and broadened the input from your co-producers. That's the first thing I'd want to say, and I can't now remember what the second was. It'll come back to me in a minute. I think it's about, it's about making a record. Just to reinforce what Andre said, we learn a lot from where it doesn't work, where people are saying, we thought we'd introduce it in this way and that didn't work because. And if you can make a record of that and include it as part of your findings, that will help others to say, oh, well, we can understand why that went wrong because we've got the same problem here. Or say, actually, we could use it here because we don't have that particular issue. For instance, the heart failure one. Some people didn't have an echocardiogram within 15 miles of where the patients were, so they obviously couldn't use one, whereas others did. So if we'd co-produced that research, we'd have taken that into account, and you need to report that when you report your research.
Does that help? We've got. Okay, no, that's just a comment, not a question.
Bye, Amanda. Thank you.
Bye bye. Any more questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Okay, go on, Rosetta.
When your husband was talking about bringing in different people in to co-production, the thought that occurred to me is that would that reduce the targeting of a research topic, that's making it broad instead of making it specific to a group of people that would be interested in that particular research?
It depends, doesn't it? How yes and no, I think, is the answer to that. So yes, you'd be expanding it, so you'd be broadening it, but in broadening it you might be adding some richness to your understanding of what was happening.
Yeah, but then,
Keep going.
Yeah, okay. For a PhD thesis, we could bring in different aspects to that particular piece of work that will involve maybe some quantitative study, some qualitative study, but in publishing it, is it better to now separate it so that it becomes really targeted, so that people can read? If people are interested in the quantitative aspect of this work, they can read it, and people that are interested in the qualitative aspect of it will read it? Or is it better to publish it as a mixed method study, even in publication, and broaden it?
If it genuinely is a mixed method study, then the whole point is that you need both the qualitative and the quantitative, because each of those gives you a different perspective and a different angle on the subject. So I think my answer would be, it would probably be misleading just to publish the qualitative bits in a qualitative journal and the quantitative bits in a positivist quantitative journal. Sorry, I was just looking at the message there. So the importance of a mixed method study is the combination of those methods. So but to come back to your original question, I might be studying a very specific, let's say, what is the optimal use of CT scans in the management of meningitis? I've just made that up. Okay, now I could do that study by just talking to meningitis microbiologists and pathologists and design an RCT, or I could involve some patients, or I could involve some hospital managers, or some community service managers, or some patients' relatives and all of those people could still be focused on that very single, specific, robust question with robust methodology, but they're bringing a different perspective to it and shedding different light on it in a different way. So co-production with a wide range of people doesn't necessarily dilute the specificity of your research question or the robustness of your research methodology.
I think there are a couple of things there. When we think about co-production, it's often co-producing the research approach, the design, and then we hand it over to the researcher to do, and they might draft in, if you like, some of those people who are originally in the design to help them collect data, and then we'll take the data back to them to help understanding develop. Or I think maybe, Rosetta, you were thinking of co-production in another way, where we can co-produce results by having different approaches, qualitative and quantitative, and hence a mixed method study. So there are lots of ways of thinking about it. Now, unfortunately, you've got me on one of my hobby horses now, which is mixed method studies that aren't really mixed methods at all. A mixed method study, you have to know why you're doing all of these different things. And usually what happens is that the qualitative or quantitative illuminates the other one, doesn't it? So you have them both and then you bring them together. It's like an hourglass, isn't it? And then you go out again. So you do them both, you bring them together, you triangulate to understand, which is what John was saying, and to complete, and then you bring them out again in your kind of description of it all.
Yeah.
So they iterate. and so there's two slightly different things going on there. But if you want to come back and chat to us about it, email us.
Yeah.
No problem.
Highly recommend. John and Andrea are very accessible. Oh, Sally, hello.
Anita, are we supposed to finish at any given time?
Yes, at 3. So I
Oh,
think
that's fine.
if
Okay.
we take Sally's
So
question,
we're already
if
over,
that's-
but carry on. We're okay.
Thank you. If maybe Sally could go for the last question then. Thank you, Sally.
Hi, yeah, thank you. It was a really interesting talk. I've just got a little quick question, if that's okay. I'm looking to do co-production throughout my entire research for my PhD, but I'm struggling to find where I can go to get funding, because obviously you need quite a lot of funding in terms of their time for every single aspect of it. Have you got any tips or ideas?
What's the topic area?
I'm trying to develop a core outcome set for end-of-life care in critical care.
And when you say you're looking for money, is that to pay people to help you to do the co-production?
Yeah, for co-production. So obviously I'd like somebody to sit on a steering group. I'd like co-production throughout the systematic review. I'd like co-production throughout all the resources, actually helping with screening. I want to do full-blown embedded co-production, which is quite expensive.
If it was me, I would try and go. And what's your discipline? End of life care, you said.
In ITU.
And are you a nurse, a doctor, a whatever, something or other?
I'm a nurse by background.
Okay. So you might look at some of the nursing charities. So you might look at the Burdett Trust and those sorts of things, who may be able to give you some money. One of my students once funded the whole of her doctoral work by getting small amounts of money. Florence Nightingale, RCN Research Institute sort of thing, Burdett Trust. So you might look at those for getting small amounts of money, which is what you would need. You might also look at Marie Curie, end-of-life care, charitable trusts like them, although they're short of money because they fund other things, which is why something like Florence Nightingale or Burdett Trust would be useful for you. And you might also then, because you're looking at intensive care, look at the relevant intensive care societies to see if they've got funds. So you're gathering all of these little pots of money up. Does that help?
Yes. FNN don't do anything. Intensive Care Society closed last week, and that's for new researchers. Everywhere I seem to go, it's kind of like, you don't need inclusion criteria.
Keep going.
Have you gone to ask Involve if they know where to go, because they may have a list of people who fund the kind of thing that they're advocating,
or whatever they're called.
Or Involve has now changed its name to something else, but the organisation that helps to involve patients and their carers in research may be able to that's somebody's just said.
Oh yes.
PPI panels are already there. Maybe you could tap into those. Yeah,
but I would just one word of warning: it's not just the patients and the public you're interested in, is it, Sally?
No,
you're interested in practitioners too.
Yeah, I'm not doing PPI. I'm doing co-production.
Yeah. So there are a whole load of different people. So possibly a little bit of dosh from lots of people. Even local trusts sometimes have charitable funds that you don't know about, that they might be able to give some money away from.
Thank you.
That's okay.
Pleasure.
Okay. Sorry, everybody. I'll stop everybody now just because of time, and I suspect you all also have the next meeting to go to. But I just would like to reiterate, Andrea and John's offer. If you would like a follow-up chat, they always say please contact, and they do respond. They're lovely.
Yeah,
so please do
I'm
contact.
sorry if we went on a bit too long to allow.
No. It's always a good sign. And I think Catherine will be in touch about the next meeting. So we'll try to fit one more before end of year. It'd be lovely, maybe late November, because early December is usually madness for most people. So we'll try to fit one, and hopefully we can do the PPI meeting that we had in mind, and you can join us.
Okay, so
thank you again.
You know where we are. Nice to meet you all. Jolly good luck.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Bye.
Bye.